All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Tashana Johnson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm part of the whole you, your well-being and engagement team here to service UW's faculty, staff, and family members, loved ones, etc. So today, I'm so glad that you all are in space with us today. Today, we'll be understanding brain health a bit more with Dr. Sheri Mizumori. A little bit about Dr. Mizumori. She's a professor and chair in the Department of Psychology, founder of the Mizumori Lab, and co-founder of the Brains Program. Her research focuses on the many mechanisms of the brain and their influence on making flexible decisions, as well as learning and memory across the lifespan. Current efforts focus on the interaction between decision and memory neural circuitry at both single cell firing rate and population neural oscillatory levels of analysis that span brain areas such as the hippocampus, frontal cortex, striatum, and midbrain structures. The hope is that this work will inform future therapeutic efforts to treat behavioral and memory disorders such as addiction and dementia. Dr. Mizumori's other passion in research is to promote the inclusion of historically marginalized populations in neuroscience and scientific discovery, which has led her to co-found the Brains Program. Sheri, I'm so glad that you're able to be here with us today. I'm going to go ahead and pivot over to you, and I'll just be here to manage tech and questions as they come up. We'll see you soon. Thank you all.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tashana. I just want to thank you for inviting me to talk about really one of my favorite subjects, and that is how brain health determines mental well-being. So here, what I would like to do is share with you in the short amount of time, really some of the latest scientifically verified tips and tools for why it is that maintaining good brain health can go a long way to helping you to gain or maintain a high level of mental well-being. Now, first, what we need to do is define what we mean when we say mental well-being. So in other words, what is the end goal of this discussion today? What is the mental state that we're trying to optimize or achieve? What is mental well-being? Well, I turned to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and they characterize mental well-being as the state where there's the presence of positive emotions and moods. And by that, I mean that you feel a sense of purpose, sense of happiness, contentment, positive outlooks for the future. And not only that, but there's an absence of negative emotions such as anxiety, worry, depression. And as a result, what you feel like is very motivated and energized. Okay, so I know that's a big complex state of being, but that's what people refer to as when they talk about mental well-being. So what does the brain have to do with this and brain health? Well, again, through decades of research, we now know that good brain health it helps to form a necessary foundation for mental well-being. That is a state that optimizes sort of positive and flexible mindsets, like what I just had described above. So the question I'm sure that's on your mind is, how can we enhance our brain health then, if this is something that we need for good mental well-being? Well, before I can answer that question, what I'd like to do is just introduce some key concepts of brain function so that then you'll know what I'm talking about when I refer to the brain. Now, anytime you think about something, say you're trying to remember that beautiful day in Seattle, well, your neurons are busy talking to one another so that they can recall the previously learned information and allow you to consciously recognize these thoughts as being Seattle. And they do this by sending messages, electrical messages amongst the elements of your brain. So your brain is made up of hundreds of billions of cells called neurons. And when the brain is processing information, like, for example, thinking of this beautiful scene, what you find is that there are a lot of different patterns of connectivity between the two that get really busy. That is, the neurons start talking in very complicated ways. Okay? And so really just, the point I wanted to make here is that when your neurons are busy talking to one another, what they do is they generate what's called an electrochemical signal. That is, they generate an electrical current that then allows them to use chemicals to communicate with the next cell in line. And so that represents a signal that your neurons are generating. Now, this sounds kind of abstract, right? And so I thought I would just show you an example of what that might look and hopefully sound right if my sound turns out okay. Now, this is just an example of how we can listen to neurons talk to one another. So this is an example of a woman here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the woman in the picture there, she has recording electrodes in her brain because the neurologists are trying to find the location in the brain that's generating irregular neural activity or epileptic seizures. And while she is waiting there, she's just viewing things on her laptop, viewing images. And what I show down below that is an image of the brain. And in yellow, that represents a structure called the hippocampus. And that's what the neurologists are targeting. Now, when let's see here, there's this picture of The Simpsons that comes on. And then what happens is were you able to hear that? I hope so. Okay. Now my screens are kind of going nuts here. Okay, so what you heard were the electrical pulses that are generated by the neuron that's being recorded. And if you plot each one of these pulses here as a line, this vertical line, as a function of time, you heard something that sounded like brrr, brrr, brrr. Well, okay, the cell's kind of active by this Simpson scene. What about another movie scene? Here's a Jurassic Park scene. And in this case, the cell fires only a little bit. It just kind of goes pop, pop, pause, pop, pop. Here's another scene from a movie that probably only I know because my daughter grew up with this movie. It's called The Wizards of Waverly Place. Again, this cell's not too excited by it. It only emits a few pulses. Now, here's a show that is pretty well known, the Star Trek. But this cell particularly doesn't seem to care too much about it. It just fires a few pops along like so. And it ends up that the cells in this structure called the hippocampus here are really excited when there's special kinds of information that it comes into your mind or that you're exposed to that reflects a memory. So it's considered a memory structure. So in other words, this cell was firing to the memory of The Simpsons, but not to these other scenes here. Now, how do we know it's memory when the person is just staring at this visual image, right? Well, you can ask her to close the laptop. But now think of a scene from The Simpsons, and you see that this cell fired a lot. When she just thinks about a scene from Star Wars, it doesn't fire as much. In other words, the person doesn't have to actually be viewing the stimulus in order to get these memory-related firing patterns to emerge. And it ends up, as I mentioned, you have hundreds of billions of cells in your brain. And so each one has a very slightly different kind of way that it likes to code information. And our task as neuroscientists is to try and decode and figure out what those different codes mean. Here's just an image. It says that as you learn information, now these are our neurons here with kind of spider-like looking arms out there. And you can see if you follow the extensions of that to the areas which kind of pink, that it connects with neurons that it's adjacent to. And then that sends a message to the next neuron. And then that second neuron sends a message to the third neuron, to the fourth neuron, and so on. And pretty soon, as you're learning the information, the same set of cells get activated over and over again. That is, we say that their connections between these cells get stronger and stronger, okay? And this is referred to as a phenomenon called neuroplasticity, that it's the ability of these cells in our brains to be flexible in the way they respond, to change the way they respond, depending on experience here. Now, it ends up that anytime you learn something, a network like this becomes activated, is kind of formed. And then the next time you remember that information or think about that information, that same network gets reactivated, but very much with a much shorter latency or a lot faster. It's as if it remembers that previous information. And because it did, it says, oh, I know this, and pretty soon you see this cycle that goes around. So as you learn more information, you're actually building the foundation of future networks that future networks can grow onto. And that concept of building this foundation is referred to as neural reserve. And so that ends up being a good thing because the more neural reserves you have, the more information you can process later on, the more flexible you can be with your processing. All of this is really important for good mental health and mental well-being. Now, in this slide, it shows that as a function of age, this neural reserve increases over time as we age. And then at some point in our lives, for different people, it might peak at slightly different places. But at some point in our lives, this neural reserves peak, and then it starts to decline. The neural reserve starts to go down with age. And so a question that people have is there a way that we can boost up this neural reserve to prevent some of the more common age-related declines in either ability or thinking and so on? That is, can we make the curve less steep? And I'm happy to say that a lot of people think that the answer is yes. That's what I'll be talking about the rest of today. Now, other people might say, well, how do we just prevent all that decline to begin with? That is, how can we potentially repair any decline in neural reserve? That, I think, is still a question that has yet to be answered, but that's something a lot of people are focusing on. Now, how can you improve your neural reserve? Well, one of the things that you can do is to treat your brain kind of like a muscle. That is, the more you use it, the stronger it gets, the stronger the connections get, right? And so as those strong connections get stronger, they're also become more plastic, right? And so another way to think about this building up of neural reserves over your lifetime is that you are also building cognitive reserves, that is strategies and tips and tools that you might have learned at one point in your life, but that you can then bring into another, say, challenge that happens to you later in life. And the easier it is for you to strategize and resolve that challenge, the better you are in terms of your mental well-being. Now, there's some people, as shown in this slide, who might have just a lower cognitive reserve than others. And what I just wanted to show is that what we think happens is that over time, across age, and again, for different people, the actual age might differ. But if you have high cognitive reserve, that can stay high for a long time in your life. And then at some point, it does start to decline. But what you can see in this graph is that people that have higher cognitive reserves, they maintain cognitive function for a longer period of time than people with low cognitive reserve. Okay. So again, a question is, how can we get, especially the people with lower cognitive reserves, up into the upper part of that curve so they have higher function for longer periods of time in their life? These are challenges that we're trying to address. Well, I would argue that one of the things that one can do are to follow, I think, a number of these tips that I am now going to give you. That is, what else can you do to help your brain to build more of these cognitive, or some people think of it sometimes as emotional reserves, that the ability to control and regulate your emotions? Well, one way that you can do it is by creating a nurturing environment so that your neurons are happier. That is, they're happier if they're healthy. And if they're happy and healthy, they're much more plastic, much more willing to engage in new kinds of information processing, come up with new ideas, and so on. And so these little cartoons here are just to help us to think about, somehow if you could give your brain a spa, a bubble bath, as one of my colleagues likes to refer to it as, that would be wonderful, right? Now, of course, I'm not meaning that you should literally give your brain a spa and bubble bath, but you get what the point of what I'm trying to say. How is it that we can do this? Okay. Well, one approach that people have taken is to say, well, let's look at some of the oldest of the old, some of the supercentenarians in the world. They tend to not only live longer, but they tend to be of very good spirits, right? They seem to have good mental well-being all the way throughout their lives. These are just some examples. The current, just more FYI, the current oldest living man is Juan Vicente Perez, and he's from Venezuela. He's 112 years old. Lucille Random is from France, and she currently is the oldest living woman. She's 118 years old. And then the people I list below are just other folks who have lived longer. The woman that's lived the longest, that we think, is Jean Clement, who is 122 years old. And the oldest man ever to have lived is Jiro-Emon Kimura from Japan. He lived to be 116 years old, and so on. So you can see that there's a number of different countries represented here. So it's not that just one particular type of culture, one particular geographic location is identified with a longer longevity, but this seems to be spread out. And so again, the question is, what is it that folks like these folks have been doing in their life that allows them maybe to have this longevity and good mental well-being? Well, by studying the lifestyles of the oldest of the old, and also studying the lifestyles of just what we call normal aging individuals, folks that might live, to up to like 80, 90s and so on. What we have learned kind of in a nutshell is that what is good for your heart, that is all the advice you get that you have been given for maintaining good heart health, also applies to the brain. That is things that you want to do to say lower cholesterol and so on, helps your heart. It also helps your brain. Okay. Now, before I talk to you a little bit about how all this happens, I want to go back now to the brain and describe one more thing about the brain. And then I'll go into more details about what you can do. I think having this information will help you to understand what I'm referring to a little bit later. Now, as we mentioned before, the neuroplasticity does decline a bit as we age, in part due to a lifetime of different experiences and challenges that your brain has had. For example, we do know that across one's life, typically, that there are toxic chemicals that tend to accumulate and increase in the brain. Some that you might have heard about are things like amyloid, which is a type of protein that tends to clump in and around the neurons. So in that picture on the right at the top, the blue cells are the neurons. The little clumps of brown looks like little balls. That's an example of amyloid. And so this just accumulates there, and it gets in the way of communication. And so we think that it's not a good thing to have. Another kind of chemical that accumulates with age is what's called free radicals. That is your brain and your cells just in the process of metabolizing the things that it has to do and metabolize, it gives off this chemical molecule called a free radical. Ends up not being good. Ends up not being kind of being toxic actually for your cells. Now, the other thing that accumulates over time is that your brain recognizes that the free radicals are not good for you. So the immune system kind of kicks in, and what it does is it tries to reduce those free radicals. But just like when you cut your finger or your hand, you see this first reaction you see is a swelling, right? And that's because your immune system is running to the place of injury and trying to heal and make it so that injury either goes away or reduces the impact. So in the brain, that ends up being neural inflammation. That is, we find that, as shown here in the bottom right image of a scan of a human brain, you see that in red, that illustrates sites of neural inflammation that exist in the brain. And so as you get older, there's increase in free radicals and amyloid, but coincident with that is also this increase in neural inflammation. And while inflammation may have initially a good intention, it actually over time could cause damage and be ultimately toxic to your neurons. Okay, so I don't want to end on this negative note. So now what I want to do is talk about what is it that you can do to keep neuroplasticity high in your brain. Well, we think about things that might help us to keep free radicals and neural inflammation under control. And one of the things that you can do is to avoid, say, foods that we know cause an increase in free radicals and inflammation. And these are listed here on the left. These are categories of foods. And so, for example, gluten, some people are allergic to gluten, some people are not, but we know that gluten causes some sort of an inflammatory response. Just in some people, it's greater than other people. Certain kind of casein protein in certain kinds of dairy products, processed meats, and so on. And you can see the list here: sugary foods, fried foods, and so on. These ends up having a lot of what's called saturated or trans fats. And what that ultimately does is to reduce neuroplasticity in the brain, probably because it's increasing the free radical and inflammation. And this can ultimately lead to depressed moods, poor cognition, that is not optimal mental well-being. So that's one thing that one can do then to maintain plasticity and maintain mental well-being, is to reduce the intake of things that cause these free radical and inflammation. But you can also eat foods that say, well, okay, let's say the free radicals are there, the inflammation is there. What kind of foods can we eat that fight the free radicals that are there, okay, and fight the inflammation that is there? And it ends up that these, as shown in this image here, are some of the what we call the top antioxidant foods. Antioxidant just means that they fight free radicals. And so you can see there's avocados and blueberries are the ones that are often touted as being superfoods. They're really high in antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds. And just for those of you who are interested, on the right, I list what some of those compounds are: vitamin A, C, E, keratin, flavonoids, polyphenols, and manganese. And in case you're not aware, some of those ingredients, like polyphenols, those are in teas. And that's why some people say that, oh, it's really healthy for you to be drinking tea. And then on the bottom, I just illustrate some other foods like edamame, these Japanese sort of beans, and miso, which is an ingredient often in Japanese food that's made from a soybean paste that also has high in these antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And there's certain kinds of seaweed. It ends up that, what about top anti-inflammation foods? We see that there's a lot of the same foods, right? The blueberries, they say, the avocados are there. And now we have a lot of the salmon, the cold water fish ends up also having high anti-inflammatory responses. And on the bottom, you can see that there's the tea again. Chocolate, yay, chocolate is one of those foods that is thought to be really healthy for you because of its antioxidant, anti-inflammatory effects. Okay, and then this, in the center on the bottom, in case you can't tell, that's actually a little bit of tofu. Okay, now there's other kinds of foods that are considered superfoods that was more recently discovered to be superfoods, and we're still trying to figure out why they are, but these end up being pickled, usually vegetables, pickled foods. So it might be sauerkraut, it might be kimchi, it might be these pickled vegetables on the left. A lot of those are from Japan, but it ends up that in many cultures, there's some vegetable or some food type that ends up being pickled. And I think going through that pickling process somehow creates these antioxidants and anti-inflammatory kinds of compounds. Okay, so what can you do to keep your neuroplasticity high? Be strategic with your diet. Again, I can answer more questions about that if you have at the end. The other thing one can do is exercise. Now, when I ask my students, I said, so why do you think exercise is good for you? And they say, well, because after you exercise, you certainly do get more blood flow in the brain. You're bringing more oxygen to the brain. And maybe that's why you feel better. Okay? And indeed, that is part of it. And by increasing your blood circulation, that keeps your vessels very plastic, right? And so that helps to protect you against future strokes. And it helps also to keep some toxins out of your brain. So very good thing to have good circulation. But it's also the case that when your muscles become active, they release chemicals that go up and get into your brain. And these chemicals, I just call them neuroplasticity chemicals, and they act as antioxidant and anti-inflammatory agents in the brain. They also have chemicals that cause the brain to make more of a certain type of chemical that is often there when you are feeling good. Hence, they call them feel-good transmitters. Ones that you might have heard about, such as dopamine and serotonin, oxytocin. All of those increase when you exercise. Other chemicals are there to fight the bad effects of stress, okay, by, for example, actually having these antioxidant kinds of reactions. Okay, let me just say that one thing about this exercise is that typically people talk about aerobic exercise, but it ends up it doesn't matter. I mean, aerobic exercise is really good, but if you do strength training or stretching, that's also good. Now, another thing is to get plenty of sleep. Now, you might say, oh, yeah, I need sleep so that I can feel rejuvenated for the next day. And that's true. But in terms of brain health, what it does is it helps you because it actually helps the immune system in a good way, not to cause neuroinflammation, but it helps it in a good way to fight off germs and things like that you might have been exposed to. It helps to clear out. The sleep helps to clear out any amyloid that accumulates during the day. And yes, you do accumulate a little bit every day. And so you need that sleep to just flush that out of your brain. And that, again, reduces the brain inflammation. It's also the case that having more sleep reduces the negative effects of stress because stress causes more of that inflammation and increased oxidation. And finally, we know, and we've known for a while, that when you sleep, your memories are better, right? And indeed, we now know that when you sleep, that allows your brain to have more neuroplasticity so that you can remember information better. And of course, that's really important for mental well-being. Now, another type of thing that you can do to maintain high neuroplasticity in your brain and hence good mental well-being is to socialize, practice compassion, set goals for the day. All of these things are things that your brain likes, feels like it's rewarding, and because of that, it releases more of those feel-good transmitters like dopamine. So when you socialize, you get a boost of dopamine. When you're compassion and you're helping other people, you get a boost of dopamine. That's why you feel good. When you set goals for the day and you check them off, ever do that? I do that a lot, actually. You check off things, it feels so good, right? That's my little shot of dopamine I'm giving myself. All of those things are good because not only makes you feel good, but it increases neuroplasticity. And all of that helps you to maintain a positive attitude, and which of course is linked to better mental health. Okay, these are just examples. And this, again, it goes cross cultures. Okay, another thing that one could do is to enjoy music. Okay, and this is sort of interesting because one would not think that, oh, how can enjoying music improve brain health? Well, it ends up that, music is rhythmic, right? And there's always kind of what they call a beat frequency, a bass beat that goes along with music of almost all genres. And it ends up that remember I mentioned before that when you process information, your cells are firing in different patterns and you have these billions of cells, right? That seems like it's going to be impossible to figure out. But it ends up that your brain also coordinates all that activity into rhythms. And it does so when you're trying to pay attention to information, when you're trying to learn information, and so on. And so it ends up that when you listen to music, that enhances your brain's ability to go to function in these cycles, to generate these brain rhythms, these oscillations, which is what I think that we were talking about in the very beginning of today. And so when you're in this oscillatory state, it ends up that enhances neuroplasticity potential. If there's a condition where there's no oscillations, then neuroplasticity goes down, mental well-being goes down. And so, of course, that ends up, go back to this. So that goes back to also like when you're listening to music and you get up and sing or you dance, again, you feel that way because your brain is functioning in those rhythms. Now, another sort of unexpected thing that music might do, and again, this is totally, still speculative, but the initial data looks really, really promising. And that is that on the left side of this figure, I just have an example of two kinds of cells. They're just called microglia. And in red, the red dots here represents that amyloid that I showed you a picture of earlier today. And it's called amyloid beta. And it ends up that there's some work, at least with animal models, that shows that when you expose these animals to rhythmic sounds, okay, kind of like that beat frequency of music that we listen to, what you find is that a lot of that amyloid gets washed away. And you can see on the right, you see that those microglia, what they do is they get really busy and they go around and collect all that loose amyloid and then get rid of it just by being exposed to these rhythmic sounds. So maybe that's another reason, another mechanism, I should say, that music can be good for your brain's plasticity as well as your mental well-being. Okay, now, so far we've talked about all these different strategies that you might engage in to keep your neuroplasticity high. So all of the above, they do reduce the negative effects of stress because a lot of the chemicals that are released during stress are neuroplasticity blockers. Okay, and so all of these different tips, the diet, exercise, sleep, and so on, they also reduce bad cholesterols, have antioxidant effects, anti-inflammatory effects. Now, it's also the case, I just wanted to mention, because a number of people do meditation and yoga these days, and indeed, there's evidence to show that this can also counter some of the stress effects on the brain to improve mental well-being, and we think that this has to do with activating a lot of these same chemical systems that I just talked about. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, then, that physical exercise is really critical to increase neuroprotection, okay, neuroprotection against exposure to some of those bad chemicals. And that allows you to have a neuroplastic environment for longer periods of time. Having high quality foods, having good sleep, socializing, and experiencing music, all are really critical for maintaining the optimal mental well-being and neuroplasticity. And also, of course, try to keep stress to a minimum. That helps your brain as well. And of course, all of these different things that I just talked about, the exercise, the food, and so on, what that does is it creates that nurturing environment for your brain so that when you come in and you're trying to learn some new information, you can learn it much better. And so then go ahead and exercise your brain, learn new information, learn a new dance, learn a new music, and so on, and it will stick better if you're engaging in all of those other things. Okay, and that helps to build cognitive reserve. Okay, so finally, let's circle back. What can we do to promote a healthy brain that enables us to achieve and maintain a healthy state of mental well-being? Increase your brain plasticity, be nice to your brain, have a nice environment, and then as you get older, functions change. It's okay. It can still be fun, right? And then that way we can age with great enthusiasm and enjoyment and optimism, which is really, I think, what we all want. All right. And with that, I just thank you for taking the time out of your day. I know that you're all super busy, so I really appreciate this. Thank you. And don't forget your brain.
Thank you, Sheri. And there is a question in the chat. I think you've spoken to it a little bit about what causes amyloids and whether or not that was known. Can you remind folks about that?
Yeah, there's a number of different ideas out there, and so it ends up that there's lots of different kinds of amyloid proteins that accumulate. Some might be genetic, so if you have the gene that produces that kind of mutation that then results in this, you might say, a malformation of this protein called amyloid, then that's what causes that those accumulations to happen. So what we don't know is, I think, whether there are external factors, environmental factors that can stress your brain so that it then tends to increase its amyloid production, because that's another possibility that people are looking at.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I will hold space for folks to drop any other questions into the chat. Take a few moments to reflect on that.
Okay.
Oh.
Do you want me to stop sharing, or do you want me to keep it up there?
You can stop sharing. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. A follow-up question on, okay, I want to say amyloid. It's
Amyloid, yeah.
Amyloid associated with dementia.
Oh, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is amyloid associated with dementia?
Oh, is it associated with dementia? I think it depends on where in your brain the amyloid accumulates. The one that is associated with dementia is when the amyloid is accumulating in the outer part of your brain called the cortex. That's the areas of the brain that are responsible for your higher level thinking, your memories, and so on. And so if those areas are affected by amyloid, then you will lead to a dementia kind of state. It's also the case that other brain areas, for example, those in the lower part of your brain, they can also accumulate amyloid. Sometimes there's detrimental effects, sometimes not, just depending on what functions are being affected there. But there's also cases where individuals who have lived a long time and then they kind of donate their brain to science, and then they find that, oh, this person was cognitively active their whole lifetime, but if you look at the brain, it's full of amyloid. Right? And so that suggests that there may be ways that we can, even if the amyloid is there may be strategies that we can engage in that will help us to compensate for any potential lost functions.
Wonderful. Another question has come through around what have studies said about how much exercise is needed for brain health?
How much exercise is needed? Yeah, that's, again, super quick question. I'd say that the typical response that most people would give is something like, if you can elevate your heart rate for about 15 minutes, whether that's by stretching a lot or vacuuming the floors or by, lifting weights or running. And if you can do that for at least 15 minutes a day, then that could result in really great effects. Now, the more you do, you have better and better effects, but up to a point. So for example, you often hear that, oh yeah, you should walk something like 10,000 steps a day to maintain the best health for physically as well as in terms of your brain. And it ends up that that number was initially arbitrary and by, I'm not sure who, but now when they actually did the research, they said, well, if you can at least get 4,000 steps, that's when you see the biggest improvement in people's health. But if you can, and it will continue to improve up to about 7,000 steps. And then after that, I mean, you can still do it, but you don't see the improvement. It doesn't add on additively after that. And so, you know, like for myself, I then say, oh, well, that to me means, oh, I should get at least 7,000 steps a day, in case you're counting. Yeah.
Thanks, Sheri. Another question is, what if in the past a person wasn't eating well or exercising and does now? How is brain health affected?
Yeah, in other words, I think that's very common for people not to eat so well, especially when they're young and then younger. And then oftentimes a lot of people will start eating healthier when they're later, like 20s, 30s, even 40s, 50s. And it can still make a difference. And it could still make a big difference. And so I would say it's never too late to get started. There are a lot of folks that start maybe 40s, 50s, even 60s, you know, and they realize that maybe because they're starting to notice things in their body is not the same as it was before. And so then they engage in all these things, make sure they have good sleep and do some exercise, change their diet. And you find there's a huge improvement in terms of their cholesterol and all the different markers what we might think of as pathological markers of not so good health. You start to see those go down, and that will help you in the going forward. So it's never too late.
I appreciate that. A couple more questions have come in. On the inflammatory food slide, it mentioned soy next to the oils as an inflammation-causing food. Then on the next slide, as brain healthy foods, it mentioned both edamame and tofu. Mm-hmm. Where does soy fall on the brain health spectrum?
Yeah, actually, it's really sharp that you noticed that, because as the slides suggest, it's a tiny bit controversial. And so I think that the edamame has soy. You're absolutely right. And so I'd say that most of the time the soy isn't so harmful for you, except for people that might be allergic to it, in which case then it could cause an allergic inflammatory sort of reaction. So that may be why that sometimes it's listed as one thing or another.
Wonderful. Do we know the dose response relationship between these factors? For example, how much exercise and music per week is correlated with a significant boost in brain plasticity?
Yeah, if I think back, I think that these kinds of studies hasn't been done in terms of measuring brain plasticity in people. They have been done a little bit in animal models, mostly in mice. Now, of course, that case, they don't actually play music, but they just play rhythmic kinds of sounds. And I think it only took them, I think like 3 weeks, 15 minutes a day or something like that, and then you find that some of those rhythmic measures, when they measure the brain activity, they find that there's more of that rhythm that's good for neuroplasticity, that exists, and that it can persist for a little bit of time, like another week or so. And so the question right now they're doing those, what I think you're thinking of is that dose response relationship study, where they're trying to see how long do you have to be exposed to it to have longer effects afterwards. People are just super excited that it had longer effects afterwards, that there can be long-term effects. And so now, again, they're trying to see what it takes. Now, I think in people, it will be, of course, a little bit different than mice, because when you're listening to music, it's not only the rhythms that are causing the say for hippocampus, for example, to go into these good rhythms, but you're also activating a memory. A lot of times, right, when you think of a song from a long time ago, and you just feel this, this is wonderful, it's so relaxing. And it's because you're thinking of a memory that's associated with that song. And that has a positive effect on your mental well-being as well. And so I think those are some factors that people have to kind of tease out.
I love that. I remember reading about a study in which folks that had dementia and other memory loss when they heard a song from their like junior high or
Yeah,
from their youth, they were able to stimulate the memories from that time as well. So,
absolutely. And so what does that tell us? It tells us that even though the person doesn't act like they remember things, that a lot of times the memories are there. And that suggests that maybe, and this is true in non-demented older people, is that their main memory problem is access and retrieving that information. And sometimes a memory can help you with that retrieval. And so then you can pull up the memory that's there. And so we think that that also happens in the Alzheimer's patients.
wonderful. Okay, I have a couple more questions coming in, and can you speak a little bit about the impacts of stress or the pandemic on brain health? Have we seen any changes to brain health? Thank you so much for that question.
Yeah, super important and relevant question these days. A lot of people are looking into this, and there's no doubt there's much more stress and stress effects, and so excuse me. And so with increased and chronic stress, what you do see is that you'll see a more accumulation of, say, these free radicals because your cells are being stressed, so they aren't producing their proteins and their chemicals in the appropriate way. It's also the case you get more neuroinflammation. And then that's all is related to mood as well. And so, as you probably have heard, there's sort of a mental health crisis right now in the country or in the world. And so it could be related to the accumulation of all of this. And now remember, I mentioned that when you have good brain health, good neuroplasticity, you're able to develop these cognitive reserves or cognitive strategies that help you to deal with challenges later on. And so if you don't have that brain health, then it's harder for you, I think, to implement strategies that you might have learned before, but it's harder for you to implement those strategies to affect, say, your current emotional state and what you're doing right now. And so that's why I think that brain health forms this core of a state that needs to have to be attended to in order for you to help you to learn to follow through and the developed strategies that you've had to help you with different situations. Now, COVID is a little bit different too, because I know that, we still don't know, but you can tell with people with long COVID, at least for some people, there's something that happened in the brain and it seems to have a long-term lasting effect. Question is, can it be recovered? We don't know. And what exactly is going on? Again, we don't know right now.
Thank you so much, Sheri. So I have a couple more questions related to memory. In terms of a memory triggered, does it matter if it's positive or negative, or is it just the intensity of the memory?
Mm-hmm. The intensity is really important. You do tend to remember strongly positive memories. You also remember some of the strongly negative memories. And overall, I guess the feeling is in the field of learning and memory and brain is that negative memories are, quote, easier to form in that they form more quickly. And it could be because a lot of times those negative memories are tied to specific sort of almost traumatic, events that your brain has been sort of evolutionarily developed so that it processes those aversive events very quickly, or just because it's for your safety, basically, is what it comes down to. And so that's why it seems like sometimes those negative or aversive events are more memorable. But there's no doubt that, there's special moments that in your life that had a lot of positive emotional meaning to you. And so that will then be a very salient memory with you, for the rest of your life as well.
Beautifully said. How do the cognitive reserves / new brain health impact new memory formation instead of old memory retrieval?
Yeah, so that's a super good question. So if you have, good brain health, your brain, your neurons have more potential to be plastic, to change, to help you retrieve information or to do different things like retrieve information and also to learn information. And when you're learning more the information with better brain health, then those connections are, they form more quickly and they're stronger. And so those memories last a little bit longer, if that makes sense. But even retrieving old memories, that requires some neuroplasticity because your brain circuits and the patterns of activity have to change in order to be able to access that information.
Awesome. One more. For current undergraduate students interested in getting involved with neuroscience research, where would you recommend getting started? And what are other good resources to learn more about brain plasticity?
Yeah, those are two kind of separate questions, super good questions. So at the University of Washington, we have some, I would guess over 200, 300 neuroscientists, PIs, faculty type that are running research programs that are spread over some 30 different departments. And so it's hard for me to say, go to this one spot or this one department because we don't really have a neuroscience department. That said, maybe what you can, so it depends on your interest because people who go into the neuroscience field can go off into a number of different directions. They can go into engineering, they can go into medicine, they can go into sort of therapy in behavioral sort of interventions. They can help with law, they can help with policy making and so on. So it depends on your interest, what might determine exactly which path you go. So if you are interested, I would just suggest shoot me an email and it's just Mizumori at uw.edu. And just kind of at least tell me a little bit about what you're thinking, and then I can direct you to some people that might be interested in helping you. We actually, and I know in our department in psychology, we focus a lot on giving undergraduate students research training and internships. And I know there's a number of other neuroscience labs who also feel the same way. So my guess is you'll probably be able to find something out there. But contact me if you have any questions about that.
Wonderful. And I just dropped the email into the chat as well for folks.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And what was the second question again? Sorry.
No worries. I gotcha. What are other good resources to learn more about brain plasticity?
Oh, yeah. So there's, if you're interested, if you're here as a student and can take a class, there is an intro to neuroscience class taught by the biology department. I can't remember if it's a 100 or 200 level, but it's an intro to neuroscience taught by Tom Daniel, and actually it's taught by a team of neuroscientists. That's an excellent place to start. Another place would be, we, in our department, psychology, we offer, and I teach actually a neuroscience of the mind class. And so that's where I introduce all the basic principles of neuroplasticity as related to all kinds of psychological phenomena that you might be interested in, including racism, development, health, mental health, sleep disorders, and so on. We talk about plasticity in all those different contexts. And I think that's where you have to learn if you're on campus and can take classes.
These are great questions, Sheri, and great responses. Thank you all. Okay, just a couple of more. Which emotion or mood is associated with the most accurate recall of information?
Which mood, emotion? That's a good question. It's really, the only reason I would have said memories about aversive events or negative events, just because your brain is kind of hardwired to process those very quickly and very, very strongly. But that said, I must say that memories are very, they change over time. And so I don't know that one or the other can always be more accurate. And so what I mean by that is, let's say you learn something at one point, and then a week later you recall that information, and every time you recall it, you're actually changing that memory a little bit. You're adding to it. You might be making it stronger. You might be associating it with something else. And then it goes back into your long-term memory in that new format. And so over your lifetime, these memories can often be changed. And so it's hard to know. And this happens for example, in the courts. they're trying to figure out who has accurate memories and who is can testify to whatever it is that either the prosecution or the defense, is interested in. And a lot of what they have to do is prove that their memories are accurate, and it ends up being really hard. I don't know if you noticed, but like if there's an accident and 3 people watching it, you have 3 different explanations for what happened. So even right there, they saw the same thing, but their brains have processed as different kind of information. Right? So it's a tricky question, but thanks for raising it.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Can you please describe what excessive drinking does to the brain, and can that be reversed if one stops drinking?
Yeah, that's a huge question in addiction research. And so I'll just first start off by saying that there are different kinds, there's a range of what happens if you stop drinking. And so for some people, if they drink only a couple drinks, they might get so hooked onto the alcohol that they just keep drinking and drinking. And then it's really hard for them to stop. You've probably heard of this addictive personality kind of phrase. And that's what that means. There's other people that can drink the same amount and then just stop instantly and seem fine, right? And then there's a lot of people in between. But on the whole, if you're an alcoholic to where it's now impairing your cognitive abilities, your ability to remember, to ability to keep a job and so on, then what you might find is that you might be experiencing motor problems. And the reason is that one of the parts of the brain that the alcohol likes to go to, perhaps almost first, is your back of the brain called the cerebellum. And that's involved in helping you to have fine motor control. And that's why when you drink a glass of wine, what you might find is you're a little bit slower than normal. You may not be as accurate in your precise, eye-hand coordination and so on, which is why it's not good to drive after you've had a drink. Now, if you stop, then in theory, it seems like it should go back. But then if you keep exposing your brain over and over and over and over again, then your cells, they're very smart, actually. They say, oh, this is not good for me, right? The cells will say, this is not good. And they will change their function to compensate for it. And so sometimes it's in a negative way, and sometimes it's in an okay way, right? And we don't know which way it's going to go. For different people, it'll go in different ways. So I know this is a complicated answer to your question. And so it definitely, if you've been drinking a lot, then by the standards, again, this is just the current standards, is I think for women, that would be 1 drink a day. For men, that would be 2 drinks a day. They said that would be the maximum you should drink, because if you drink more than that, then your brain might start to show changes. And then over time, those changes can become long lasting.
Thank you so much for that. I have 2 more questions. I think we might have time for a couple, 1 or 2 after, but let's see how we go. So what about someone with ADHD? How does neuroplasticity help learning?
Yeah, so ADHD is really interesting, because I think that's, again, that's a label for probably a range of symptoms, all of which we consider ADHD, right? And so it's, there's not going to be a single answer, I think, for that whole condition. I think that the neuroplasticity some people think that the neuroplasticity that's happening in a typical, whatever the typical is, ADHD person, it could be happening really fast, right? And not only that, when neuroplasticity is important for learning new information, but it's also important for being able to say, oh, wait, that's not the right behavior anymore. I don't want to do that anymore. I need to switch to something else. You need to be flexible with your response, right? And so you need neuroplasticity in a different way in order to be able to switch. And so some people who are for example, people who are pretty compulsive, then they tend to exhibit the same behaviors over and over and over again. They know they don't want to do it. They know they shouldn't do it, but it's really hard to stop. And so in order to stop, that part of the brain that's responsible for that switching may need more neuroplasticity. That's what it comes down to, or at least different kinds of plasticity. Wonderful. And so ADHD can help learning, but it could also interfere if it gets too extreme.
Wonderful. All right. Do you have any suggestions or advice for folks that experience sleep disorders? for what they can do to support their brain health.
Yeah, I think that if you have a sleep disorder, I would strongly recommend going and getting tested so you know why you have that sleep disorder. Whether it's, for example, something to do with your breathing versus something in your brain that's not functioning optimally, and maybe there's a way that you can train your brain to go into these different stages of sleep overnight. But if it's due to other factors like apnea or something, then that's a different situation. So I think that one thing that in sleep is really an interesting phenomena, because as you know, you go through different stages of sleep, you go deeper and deeper and deeper into sleep. What you want to be able to do is to stay asleep in deep sleep long enough so that you can have a lot of those beneficial effects of sleep. And that often happens maybe a few hours into a night's sleep. So you start at the shallow sleep where it's kind of easy to wake you up, and then you go deeper and deeper and deeper as the night goes by. But as you go into those deeper stages of sleep, that's when all those positive, cool things happen. And so you really want to get something at least like that 5-6 hours of sleep. But ideally, people are saying 7 hours. It's kind of, I'm not saying there's a perfect absolute number, so I'm a little bit ambivalent about that. But just, I think you do need at least about that 6 hours of sleep.
And here's our last question. How does brain health / neuroplasticity apply to any degree to individuals with early dementia or early cognitive decline?
Okay, what was the middle part of that again? I missed the few.
Oh, yeah, no problem. So how does brain health and neuroplasticity apply to individuals with early dementia or early cognitive decline?
Oh, yeah. So, so as you know, as you go through your life, as you age, and you will notice there's a change in your cognition. Maybe you can't remember as well, right? And that's because you're always losing cells. You're always losing some connectivity in your brain, but oftentimes you don't notice it because you're somehow mentally and neurally compensating for these changes. And at some point, those changes may become so severe that you start to notice it, and then it's harder for you to compensate. And that might be considered the earlier stages of dementia. But we do know that there's a lot of work now trying to figure out, again, doing this kind of a dose response curve to figure out how much brain training or how much memory training do you need to be able to improve the early symptoms, is that we do know that if we can somehow have someone that's in even the preclinical stages, engaging in all these brain health exercises and things, that can help to extend a higher quality of cognitive health, even into those early stages. I'm not saying that will reverse any of the neuropathological things that are happening, but somehow it's stimulating these compensatory kinds of reserves and cognitive functions there. So it definitely is good. If you know that, so for some people who are feeling maybe for family reasons, that they're predisposed to dementia, then, I certainly would recommend as early as possible, even before there's any symptoms, is practice these kinds of activities that I talked about as ways to keep your brain as healthy as long as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Sheri Mizumori. We're seeing so many, lots of positive feedback, and thank you about the valuable information that was shared today. Again, I've dropped emails into the chat, and just thank you so much for being here today with us. We'll be sharing the recording of this presentation in just a couple of weeks here. And we just want to wish you well and take good care. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Great questions. I'm really impressed. Bye.
Bye. Take good care. Thanks.